From the heights of Mount Olympus, the flame begins its journey through the four corners of the animal kingdom, bringing with it drama, joy, and sorrow, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat.
In the year 1980, the Summer Olympics was to be held in Moscow, Russia. But due to the Soviet Union sending troops to invade Afghanistan, many Western countries, including the United States, participated in an organized boycott of the 1980 summer event. This had a major effect on several media companies planning on broadcasting the event, especially NBC, who had contracted a small animation studio known as Lisberger Studios to create a full feature-length film to celebrate the Olympics, and it was to be broadcast in parts during both the Summer and Winter Games. The movie that I'm talking about, and what you're seeing clips of right now, is called Olympics. It's a fairly decent animated feature showcasing animals taking part in Olympic sports with a bit of comedy mixed in. But while it has some things to admire, especially the production values coming from such a small animation team, there's not really too much to say about the film itself outside of the circumstances that crushed the plans for its release and its intro cinematic. This intro utilized a new animation technique where the frames of animation would be backlit against black to create this striking neon glow effect. This would become the backbone of the next project the team would work on. While Olympics would still be partially released for the Winter Olympics in February of 1980, and a year later would have a full theatrical edit combining the summer and winter segments released across multiple networks including NBC, HBO, and the Disney Channel, the morale of the team of animators that spent so long bringing it to life was at a low point. The disappointment over the botched release of Olympics led the team to take a major risk and create one of the most ambitious movies of all time using their new idea of backlit animation. Tron was a film released in 1982. Directed by Steven Lisberger, it showcased the story of a game developer being sucked into the world of the games he's built, only to find a group of programs who have built a religion around him and the other users of the computer system, and that are being oppressed by a malicious artificial intelligence program. While other movies that would come out after it would expand upon the concept of seeing secret worlds of seemingly inanimate objects and what they do when you're not around, the original Tron has a magic to it that has never truly been replicated, even by its own sequels. I want to dive deep into this movie and showcase why I love this movie, why I think it holds up today just as well as it did when it came out, and pay tribute to the immense amount of work and talent that went into Tron's creation. Before we get into the story and characters, I think it's important that we address the elephant in the room, and that's the look of the movie. This movie has an art style to it that is completely unique. The mix of primitive CG, hand-drawn animation, and interesting costume design all come together to form this intricate cyber world. While it may look dated to some nowadays, let's put this into perspective. Tron was released in July of 1982. just over 6 full years before Who Framed Roger Rabbit became the prime example of how to mix live action and animation, 9 years before Terminator 2 masterfully blended CG with live action to create a result that still looks fantastic today, and 13 years before Toy Story released as the first fully CG animated movie. This look was achieved when the Atari 2600 was cutting-edge technology. And to talk about how this look was achieved with such early computer graphics, we need to go back even further to the original idea behind the iconic design. A lot of the background that I'm going to be talking about in this video actually comes from the 2002 documentary The Making of Tron. It's available to watch on the Blu-ray release of Tron alongside a ton of other behind-the-scenes aspects. If this kind of stuff interests you and you want to see it even further than I'm going to go in this video, I'd highly recommend getting this Blu-ray release if you can find it. Steven Lisberger began his filmmaking career while he was still a student at Tufts University in Somerville, Massachusetts, with experimental animated short films. One of his films was actually nominated for the Student Academy Awards in 1973, known as Cosmic Cartoon. One of the animators of the project actually uploaded it directly to YouTube, so I'll have that linked in the description. In the comments, he actually goes on to talk about how they wanted to automate certain processes of animation, but they didn't have the idea for Tron at the time. Tron's main inspiration would come later, but even discussions about wanting to automate certain tasks and the creativity on display with the animated short show just how much Lisberger wanted to try out new ideas and concepts. Lisberger would eventually go on to create his own animation studio to try many more experimental forms of animation, and eventually found one that stood out in a bold way, that being backlit animation. The way they would actually do this is by having cutouts that would block parts of a light source and photographed in sequence to put it to film. Tron would use a slightly different technique than this, using negatives from the film as a replacement for the paper cutouts, but the idea was the same. Because of the electronic look to the film, they nicknamed the person throwing the discs in the video Tron. They actually licensed out that intro to advertise a few radio stations, and it was fairly effective because of how eye-catching it was. Eventually, their work on commercials and other small projects would lead to them being approached by NBC, where, as I talked about in the intro to this video, the team began their large-scale productions with a made-for-TV movie to celebrate the 1980 Olympics starring talking animals called Animalympics. Well, actually, it's more of a mini-series. I actually have no idea how to classify Animalympics because it was a series of shorts that were edited together to the length of a movie and broadcast as a movie, but it feels weird to call it a movie per se. And in the intro, when I said that this was a small animation team, I mean that this thing started with a team of about 6 animators and a handful of people to paint backgrounds and color the animations. It would grow as the project progressed, but accepting that deal from NBC must have been a huge undertaking. Discouraged by the breakdown of Animalympics' release, Lisberger and his team really wanted to find a way to bring their idea of Tron to life in a feature film. They pitched the idea to a number of studios, but every single one they approached unfortunately rejected the idea because of how different and confusing it was. That was, until a certain mouse came along. At the time of Lisberger pitching this idea, Disney was in a bit of a rut. By no means in a terrible position, the company wasn't the powerhouse innovator it once was. Despite it being just over a decade after the death of Walt Disney, his unfortunate passing still had a substantial effect on the company as a whole. Many of Disney's movies at the time were getting mixed reception, and nothing was taking the world by storm quite like the films created when Walt was alive. On top of that, there was extra pressure put on the studio with the release of Star Wars in 1977 and its sequel in 1980, both becoming landmark titles in the history of filmmaking as a whole. Disney at the time was looking for something new and innovative they could work on, and were receptive to Lisberger's ideas, but they had some reservations as Lisberger was a first-time director, so they instead funded work on a short film as a test drive of the idea, mixing together live action with their style of backlit animation. This test film would be a major success, and Disney greenlit the project to produce the feature film. It did have some differences to the final movie, however. A big difference was the idea to film the actors on a black stage rather than a white one, because it would be so expensive to light a large white stage. Even though it was originally for a budget reason, I think stylistically it was to the film's benefit.
The studio was really pleased with how that test came out, and I think, you know, that That so surprised them when they felt, oh my God, this is never going to work, that when it did work, the pendulum swung back with a lot of force. And now it's like, if this works, then maybe all sorts of other things that this film is attempting to do could work equally well.
Also, outside of these clips from the making of documentary, I haven't been able to find anything else from this short film. If anyone knows where I can find it, please let me know. I would love to see this. Because the film was so experimental, the team had actually storyboarded the entire movie before even casting the actors for the project. It's hard to even say that CG was in its infancy at the point of Tron's production. It was almost like the idea was still in the womb. It was such an alien concept that the Academy Awards actually banned the movie from getting any awards for its effects. They actually believed that the filmmakers cheated by using computers. And on that note, I would like to extend a big fat middle finger to the people running the Oscars in 1982 for being complete morons. At least it was nominated for costume design and sound mixing, and it did win one of the smaller categories for technical achievement. But barring it from even being nominated for Best Visual Effects is annoying, especially since the only other nominees were E.T., Blade Runner, and Poltergeist, which are great for their effects in their own right, but come on, they hand-painted the frames! But I'm getting ahead of myself. CG technically had been in movies before Tron. The original Star Wars used CG to show a wireframe of the Death Star, but that was only for an extremely small section of the movie. It's actually ironic how little CG there was if you compare it to what it looks like now. Lisberger knew they had to keep CG to a minimum if they wanted to have the film done within a reasonable amount of time. So they partnered with Information International Incorporated, mostly just shortened to III, and Magi Synthavision to handle a lot of the CG rendering. A lot of the designing and math for the object placement was still done in-house and communicated to the CG teams, sometimes relaying hundreds of numbers over the phone.
There really was no software to make anything move. There was only software to describe where things sat. And if you wanted something to go from here to here, it was literally as simple as, X is 4, now X is 6, there's 2 units, and that was that. We had to go ahead and break it down frame by frame by frame, increment by increment, because let's say you've got an object, like a light cycle. A light cycle, for every frame that it moves, it will need at least 6 numbers to describe its position. It will need its X, Y, and Z translations to show where it is in space, and then it will need its yaw, pitch, and roll to describe how it's tilting. So that means for 100 frames, you need 600 numbers of data. 100 frames is 4 seconds. So what we would do is we would figure out on graph paper, okay, the light cycle is going to start here on frame 1, and then 3 seconds later on frame 72, it's going to be over here, and it's going to travel an S curve. So gee, if I just take frame 1, frame 20, frame 60, and frame 72, I'll just take those 4 frames, I'll run down the hall, I'll plug those into the Oxbury computer thing, I'll hit a button, and all these numbers will come up. And then I just sat there with my exposure sheet, and I wrote down all 600 numbers on an X sheet. And we gave these guys at the computer company these exposure sheets with 6 rows of numbers for every single frame. And they went and they hand programmed them in. They typed them in. There was no way to just download it. You didn't have a floppy disk you could put it on. You just, you typed it.
While planning out the movie, Disney told Lisberger that any designer he wanted to help with the project, they would try to get them. This led to hiring Sid Mead, known primarily at the time for his work in industrial design and his work on Star Trek the Motion Picture, and Gene Giraud? I am so sorry. Luckily, I actually can pronounce his nickname, Mobius. He was primarily known for his work in the French comic book industry. Sid Mead would be responsible for a lot of the designs on the movie, including the light cycle, the MCP, the more militaristic costumes, Sark's ship, and so much more. After Tron, he would go on to do designs for Blade Runner, Aliens, and so many more productions. He unfortunately passed away in December of 2019, but his work made a huge impact on the industry as a whole. His work was actually a big inspiration for the designs of the AT-AT in The Empire Strikes Back. Mobius would be responsible for the design of the Solar Sailor, a lot of the more spiritual costumes, Dumont's pedestal, and a few other aspects of the movie. After Tron, he would actually start working for Marvel Comics for a considerable length of time. He passed away in March of 2012. Both of these designers were a huge part of what made Tron possible. They may no longer be with us, but their impact can't be understated. It's crazy how much thought has to go into making designs that are unique and eye-catching, but also simple enough to be possible for the computing power of the time. After realizing just how labor-intensive this film was going to be, the team concluded on making about 15 to 20 minutes of CG for the film. And if you've seen the movie, that may sound like an oddly low amount of time, but a lot of the things that look like CG, such as the transformation sequence into the light cycles, were actually hand animated to look like CG. A large amount of the movie was actually animated using airbrushes to give the environments a more textured look. But combining animation with live action in the way that they did came with its own set of problems. The first of which was the question, how do you put CG onto film? The answer was actually simpler than you may think, but incredibly time-consuming. The computing power at the time meant that each individual frame would take a long time to render, sometimes as little as 10 minutes, but in more complex scenes it could take upwards of 6 hours. When a frame would eventually render, they would just take a picture of the computer screen and combine it with the film of the actors. This was a time-consuming process, but what took even more time was the way the actors were shot to give the film its iconic look.
What was staggering was the actual technique that we finally used, which was to blow up every single frame of 75 minutes of film to a 14-inch Kodalith, and then treat a live-action movie like an animated movie.
The actors would be filmed against a black background, and then that film would be re-exposed to new film over and over again with cutouts in order to create several layers that would then come together in the finished product. This entire process of layering different parts of the film together was so complex that they had to make the decision to have all the actors wear helmets, because the hair was just too difficult to cut out and re-expose.
People think it was an aesthetic decision that we weren't going to have hair in the film, but it turned out we couldn't have hair in the film. We couldn't technically mat the hair.
Right.
We didn't have the capability. So the decision had to be made early on in the process that we were going to eliminate the hair.
There were a few issues with the actual filming part of production. Because CG was a concept that just didn't exist at the time, the actors noted that it was really hard to visualize what it was they were supposed to do or how to react to certain events. There were also some issues with both the cast and crew getting distracted because arcade games were left near the set, and even Steven Lisberger was apparently guilty of slacking off and playing games during production occasionally.
The set was littered with all of the latest video games. You can imagine all the cast and crew, wanting to rally them to get back to work, and they say, "Well, wait, just 1 second," and that was often the case. And Steven was often right in there too,
On top of this, the heavy focus on animation and CG led to a lot of crunch on the actual filming. Lisberger spoke about this in a promotion for Tron Legacy, where he opened up about the fact that they were sometimes working 13 days in a row with no break, right at the legal limit. There was also an admittedly humorous moment where there were so many lights on set at one point that they blew the fuses for the city of Burbank and caused a large-scale brownout. There was also a major problem of getting actors to understand what the project even was and getting them to sign up for it. A lot of actors would be impressed with the idea, see the costumes and how it was being filmed, and then immediately drop interest in the project. I can't exactly blame them. We can see how the movie looks now, but at the time when there was nothing to show but these skin-tight costumes with lines drawn on with a Sharpie marker, yeah, it's not surprising people initially said no, especially considering it was a Disney production at a time when Disney wasn't really pushing the envelope in terms of filmmaking. And the film being directed by a first-timer wasn't much help either. Luckily for Lisberger, one of the actors they cast for the production was Jeff Bridges, who expressed interest in the project and was willing to see it through. And a lot of the other actors on the film talked about how it was the fact that Jeff Bridges had already signed on that convinced them to join the project as well. Despite a few hiccups, the actual filming and production of the film went remarkably smooth, all things considered. There were a lot of roadblocks and stressful moments wondering if the project would even work, but there was so much pre-planning because of how ambitious the idea was that a lot of the issues were expected and the team was ready to tackle them. Unfortunately, however, the biggest problem facing this movie was not in its production, but rather its release. As if the world itself was against allowing Lisberger to have a smooth release, the timing of Tron's release would be a disaster. The original plan was to start playing the movie in theaters around Christmas of 1982, but after seeing what other companies were releasing in the summer of 1982, they believed that Tron could very easily compete and move the release date from December to July. This, unfortunately for Disney, put Tron up against a film that in 1982 was the highest grossing film of all time. Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial. God, this movie just hates anything even remotely related to video games, doesn't it? I'm gonna assume Disney probably thought, Spielberg's doing some alien puppet thing, yeah, we could put Robo-Man next to that. But that line of thinking backfired very hard. While it was still profitable, grossing $50 million compared to its $17 million budget, it was completely overshadowed by Spielberg and his team. On top of that, the movie didn't really connect that well with audiences at the time. Computers were not widespread, and wouldn't be fully adopted in the general public until much later. I grew up in the 2000s, and even then computer access wasn't as abundant as it is today. Tron released at a time when people were scared of new technology changing the world, and the fact that the movie relied so heavily on terminology and concepts that the public didn't even know at the time made it much harder for people to connect with it. But over the years, as computers became more accepted and widespread, the film became a cult classic, and it even led to Disney attempting a revival of the series in the early 2010s. My first introduction to Tron was actually through Kingdom Hearts 2, and while I really liked the world, I didn't really have too much interest in checking out the movie. During my freshman year of college, however, I was watching Doug Walker's Disney-cember, and I saw clips of the actual movie and it blew me away. Because I had played Kingdom Hearts 2, I had an idea of what the movie looked like, but actually seeing the actors themselves with the hand-painted film looked incredible. It was so different to anything I'd ever seen before that I immediately went looking for ways to watch it, and came across the Blu-ray of both the original and Tron Legacy, which I did see trailers for in 2010 and thought it looked really cool but never checked it out. In hindsight, I don't even know why. This would have been right up my alley when I was in middle school. I see so many people when talking about Tron either say, yeah, I saw Tron, it was cool, Daft Punk did the soundtrack, the fight scenes were great, loved it, not even realizing that Tron Legacy was a revival sequel to a cult classic, or they'll say, yeah, I've seen Legacy, but I never watched the original. I don't necessarily blame them for this. If you saw Tron Legacy and liked it for the action in the world, and then you go back to the original and you see it looks like this, it's not something that a lot of people would go out of their way to check out. But I believe the original has a ton of merit, and that's why I'm dedicating an entire video to it and just spent the last 22 minutes talking about the history behind the project. I think it's important for me to hammer in just how much of a gamble this movie was. But now I want to go into the film itself, and talk about why I love it so much, as well as showcase how it connects with audiences today far better than it did when it came out. We open up on a busy arcade. A scene that makes me sad that I grew up in a time when arcades had pretty much kicked the bucket. A lot of the machines were reskinned for copyright purposes, but a few real machines are in the background, as well as a reference to the game Space War, which was actually a game created by Atari as a proof of concept before they even made Pong, so really cool touches. We cut to someone playing the game Light Cycle, as we transition into our first glimpse of the computer world. Lisberger had spoken about seeing the game Pong and being reminded of gladiatorial combat, and this is the first example of seeing that idea brought to life. We see one of our major villains of the movie, Commander Sark, as he beats out the player in the arcade game. Afterwards, we cut to him having a conversation with the main villain of this movie, the Master Control Program. I love the look of the MCP. It's so threatening despite how little detail there is. This is actually the same face as that early test of 3D animation with the guy juggling. It's literally the same model just stretched into this all-encompassing room. We hear the MCP mention bringing military programs in to participate in the games, foreshadowing the MCP's master plan, while also giving Sark a lot of details to his character as he's enthusiastic for the challenge, as all the programs he's beaten before were nothing to him.
What branch of the service?
Strategic Air Command.
Nice.
The next scene showcases a program being ordered around by guards into a prison cell, and we can find out a lot of information about how this world operates in a really short amount of time.
Hey, look, you guys are gonna make my user, Mr. Henderson, very angry. He's a full branch manager.
Great. Another religious nut.
From the guards ordering him around and calling him a religious nut when he mentions the users and him acting extremely confused by the whole endeavor, we can tell that he's not some kind of criminal in this world, but rather someone who opposes the system. He meets another program in his neighboring cell.
You believe in the users?
Yeah, sure. If I don't have a user, then who wrote me?
He's asked if he believes in the users, showcasing that the world outside of the computer is another plane of existence that they can't confirm truly exists. They see the users as divine, as they give their lives purpose. This conversation is such a good bit of world building, explaining how this whole world operates in such a short amount of time, while also delving into the themes that the story is going to tackle going forward. They also talk about how things used to be different before the Master Control program showed up and started micromanaging everything. At the time of this film's release, computers were primarily used in business spaces, and the idea of home use was something that even a lot of people working with computers at the time thought would be impossible. So we see the business-centered MCP trying to micromanage everything for the sake of efficiency, while the personal use programs are being subjugated, held in prison cells, trained for the games, and eventually executed.
I mean, sending me down here to play games. Who does he calculate he is?
I want that on a t-shirt. It's so dumb, but I love it. Meanwhile, in the real world... Okay, this movie has so many groundbreaking effects, I'm willing to give it a pass on this one. It was most likely added last minute to help explain things the audience didn't quite understand. We get to see our main character, Kevin Flynn, played by Jeff Bridges. He is hands down the best part of this movie. He has such a good laid-back energy for a good portion of the movie, but knows when to get serious. We see him running his program Clue, as they try to launch an attack on the MCP to find some specific data. But I just have to take a minute here to gush about the interior of these tanks. Just look at this! The tank interior was designed by Sid Mead, and god damn he knocked it out of the park with this look.
Do you think we can merge with this memory bit? Yes.
I'm kinda torn on the bit. I absolutely love it as a computer joke, as a bit is either a positive or a negative electrical signal, but it only shows up for a short amount of time, and it doesn't really add anything other than a short joke. But it is a nice nod to how computers actually work. Clue eventually crashes the tank and is captured by the MCP to be interrogated. One thing that I think is a bit odd is that before the torture scene, Clue has very robotic mannerisms that disappear when his connection to Flynn is lost, and he begins to act far more human when being interrogated.
Forget it, Mr. High and Mighty Master Control!
I would actually really like this aspect, but it's pretty inconsistent with the rest of the movie. This scene builds up a lot of intrigue and gets the audience to ask a few vital questions. What data is Flynn trying to find? Why is the MCP so headstrong in protecting it? And how exactly does this world operate? In a pretty cool looking transition, we move back to the real world and get a really cool looking shot of this helicopter. There's actually not any lights on the helicopter itself. If you look at the end of the movie, you can see how it normally looks. The helicopter is actually covered in reflective tape, and the light is on the camera, not the helicopter. It's similar to how the lightsaber effects were done in the original Star Wars trilogy. The man in the helicopter is Ed Dillinger, played by David Warner, and he does such an amazing job in his roles in this movie. I'll get into why in a bit, but he plays Dillinger, Sark, and he's also the voice of the MCP. Dillinger is a higher-up at ENCOM, who communicates and forms plans with the Master Control program. They discuss Flynn's attempts to get into the system, and in response to his actions, they decide to lock out their own developers from the system to keep Flynn out. Now that sounds like a dumb idea at first, but the MCP is a learning AI program, We find out later in this movie that the MCP is infiltrating other systems, and not just gathering information on rival companies, but also adding their program's functions to his own. After becoming a much smarter machine than it was originally intended to be, cutting off access from the developers in-house is a minor issue, as their functions are almost minimalistic compared to the MCP. He sees Flynn as the only real hindrance to his own development, because if Flynn finds the data that he's looking for, it'll hurt ENCOM as a whole, and in turn, the MCP. This scene also raises a major question for a later payoff. The MCP has the file that Flynn was trying to gain access to, but even when Dillinger asks, he refuses to delete it. It builds up a bit more intrigue into what this data even is, but it also asks an even bigger question. Why is this computer program, that should be doing what it's told, not following orders? We see a programmer named Alan, played by Bruce Boxleitner. Alan is brought into Dillinger's office to be told about the programmer lockout.
And it should only be a couple of days. What's the project you're working on?
Well, it's called Tron. I sent you a memo on it.
Part of the master control program?
No, it'll run independently. Can watchdog the MCP as well.
Well, we should have you running again in a couple of days, I hope.
This frustrates him, and he goes down to meet up with his girlfriend, a mechanical engineer named Laura. Laura's played by Cindy Morgan, and works in the laser lab. This scene was filmed in the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where they were, and from my brief research seem to still be, conducting tests with high-power lasers. This is actually one of the only times that a film crew was allowed to work in this lab. We see Laura and another person who I'll talk a little bit about later, working on their research to digitize physical matter.
A laser dismantles the molecular structure of the object, and molecules remain suspended in the laser beam. Then, when the computer plays out the model, like the molecules fall back into place, and voila!
Great.
While suspending physical matter inside a laser beam to deconstruct it isn't a thing in real life, laser scanning 3D spaces and objects to essentially digitize them is a common thing done today for 3D modeling work. They even joke about that in some of the behind the scenes for Tron Legacy, talking about how they actually had to scan the actors into a computer with a laser, like they did in the original movie. Alan and Laura guess that the reason the programmers are being locked out of the system is because of Flynn, and they head to his arcade to confirm it. They come across Flynn gathering a crowd of people watching him achieve high scores, in a game that may look extremely primitive now, but this movie came out only a few months after Dig Dug. 3D wasn't even possible at the time, so seeing something like this in an arcade would legitimately draw crowds like this. Side note, I love the little details in the background, like having the recognizer as a neon sign. After Alan and Laura get a chance to talk with Flynn, we finally get to know what he was looking for in the system.
Okay. Sherman, set the Wayback Machine for 3 years ago. Kevin Flynn. He starts going in at night, sets up his own private memory file, and begins writing a program for a video game he's invented called Space Paranoids. All right, now we take you 3 months later. Dillinger presents ENCOM with 5 video games that he's invented. The slime didn't even change the names, man. He gets a big fat promotion.
A lot of the games being played at the arcade were actually made by him, and Dillinger took the code written for the games and passed the creations off as his own, leading to him getting a major promotion and ejecting Flynn from the company. Flynn is running the arcade to try and at least make some money off the games he's made, while sending in agent programs to find proof that he was the one who made the games. We also get some insight into the previous romantic relationship between Laura and Flynn. And god damn it, Bridges does such a great job being a wisecracking dick.
She still leave her clothes all over the floor?
Flynn.
No.
Alan!
Well, I mean, not that often.
Now you can see why all of his friends are 14 years old.
Touche.
Alan talks to Flynn about the program he was working on to keep the MCP in check called Tron, and the group realizes that they can actually regain access to the system. As the team heads over to the ENCOM building, we get the centerpiece scene of this entire movie, showcasing the clashing ideologies within the company. Dr. Walter Gibbs, that's the guy that I was going to say I was going to get back to later, by the way, and Dillinger discuss the programmer lockout and the purpose for computers.
I can't sit here and worry about every little user request that comes in.
User requests are what computers are for.
Doing our business is what computers are for.
At the time, computers only existed in the business sphere. Home use was just something that didn't exist. And we can see, looking at the world around us, that oddly enough, both ideologies won out. Think about this. How are you watching this video? You're either on a phone, a computer, or a TV. That may seem like clearly the home use won out over the big business computers, but really, unless you have this video downloaded, you're just connecting your home device to a much bigger computer system sitting in a data farm. This movie treats the use of computers for home use and for business use as clashing ideologies, and while they are at their core with the machines themselves, the invention of the internet severely blurred those lines. Despite this, I would still say that in the modern world, the home computer definitely did win out, because without home devices built specifically for servicing user requests, a lot of the big business machines for things like Google, Amazon, etc. would just be slabs of metal with nothing to do. In 1982, it was constantly thought that the business computer would win out, but Lisberger, along with pretty much anybody he worked with on this movie, were able to see how things would change in the future. And it's only fitting that one of the deepest scenes in the movie is immediately followed by one of the dumbest. And I don't mind at all.
Now that is a big door.
The filming location was an actual testing site for nuclear radiation, so that's a real radiation door. They actually had an incident on set where Cindy Morgan accidentally stepped into a radioactive zone, and they had to have her decontaminated.
And when I needed my makeup touched up, so I was on my way over to get that done, and I just stepped into the roped off area, and everybody around went, "Stop!" And I had stepped into what apparently was a live nuclear little area. And I had to stand very still until my shoe was professionally denuclearized.
We cut back to Dillinger having a discussion with the MCP, as it talks about trying to hack into the Pentagon. Dillinger's taken aback by this and tries to reason with it, but we get answers to why the MCP isn't taking orders and why the MCP hasn't deleted the file containing the proof that Flynn made the video games.
If you think you're superior to us...
You wouldn't want me to dig up Flynn's file and read it up on a VDT at the Times, would you?
You wouldn't dare.
The MCP is an AI that can actually think for itself, and it's holding the files as blackmail to keep Dillinger in line. This raises the stakes a lot for the team, as they're about to try to get back into the system with the MCP watching over them. Quick little side note, we also get a glimpse of Sark's ship before it's fully shown in the computer world, and little details like that are really cool. Laura sets Flynn up on her computer, and the MCP greets him.
You shouldn't have come back, Flynn.
Hey, it's the big master control program everybody's been talking about.
He actually asks Flynn to stop his actions politely before becoming more demanding, but when Flynn refuses, the MCP takes control of the situation in the only way he really can. The MCP turns on the laser to pull Flynn into the computer world. Which, okay, even though I absolutely love this movie, I need to call out where some of the problems exist, and why is the computer in the direct path of the laser? I get they were working with a real laser lab and probably couldn't have the MCP move the laser, but it still bugs me. Despite that, however, holy shit, this is such a cool effect. It's entirely done by hand-drawn animation. And believe me, we're going to be seeing a lot more animation going forward. This movie's pacing is actually really well done. It doesn't go, here's your main character, and bam, they're in the new world. The movie takes its time to introduce Flynn and let us learn about his struggles before it puts him into the computer world.
Oh man, this isn't happening. It only thinks it's happening.
Flynn is in utter disbelief. The dreamer of the programming team, the inventive one with creativity, and the one who would be the most in tune with this world's existence, can't even believe that this world exists. Flynn is brought to the prison cells from the beginning of the movie. The layout and function of the prison cells, allowing for easy communication but limited movement, cleverly parallels the way the cubicles are set up in the office building in the real world. He meets up with one of the programs we saw in the beginning of the film, an actuarial program played by Dan Shore named RAM, and another program that is later revealed to be the program Alan was working on, Tron. While it's cool to have a bit of build-up and see Tron before he's officially introduced as a character, I feel like the fact that he's constantly turned away from the camera makes it hard to tell that it even is Tron. I didn't even know it was him until making this video. It probably would have been better if they had the program from earlier reintroduced here to help give more weight to the ring game scene. Flynn is told he's going to have to participate in the games, to which he's confident because of how good he is in the arcade.
I play video games better than anybody.
The new prisoners, Flynn included, are brought to Commander Sark for an explanation of their current situation. Sark explains that belief in the users will be their own downfall, and intimidates the programs while also offering them a spot in the MCP's army if they give up their beliefs and profess loyalty to the MCP. If they don't comply, they're going to be forced to play in the games until they either learn to love the MCP or die.
Those of you who renounce this superstitious and hysterical belief will be eligible to join the warrior elite of the MCP.
Sark then explains the concept of the data disk. It's basically a way to hold information, while also being a cool weapon in reference to the original Tron animation. This is actually a funny coincidence because discs, whether magnetic discs in a hard drive, or optical discs for CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, etc., are the way to store data nowadays. While it may seem like SSDs are taking over and hard drives and optical storage discs aren't being used too much anymore, discs are still currently the #1 way to store large amount of data in data centers that still need to be accessed on an occasional basis. But disk-based storage didn't really become a thing until way after the movie. While the term disk, with a K, was used to refer to magnetic storage mediums like floppy disks, they never actually took the disk shape until far after this movie. So good job unintentionally predicting the future of technology. To go back to Sark for a bit, his voice is absolutely perfect in creating such a commanding presence. And it's so easy to see why the rest of the programs are afraid of him. There was a scene earlier I skipped over where we see Commander Sark having a conversation with the MCP. The MCP tells Sark that there's a new challenger for the games, but when Sark is told that the newcomer is a user and not a program, he immediately has reservations.
What kind of program is he?
He's not any kind of program, Sark. He's a user.
A user?
That's right. He pushed me in the real world.
I don't know, user, I mean... Users wrote us. A user even wrote you.
No one user wrote me. I'm worth millions of their man-years.
In every scene where he's with his soldiers, he decries the mere existence of users and shows no weaknesses. But behind closed doors, when he only has to answer to the MCP, we see his true nature. He not only knows the truth about the existence of the users, but he holds them in just as high of a regard as the programs he imprisons for expressing their faith in the users. While I think David Warner does a fairly decent job as Dillinger, when he's playing the role of Sark, his performance truly shines as someone with a mask of such authority, but behind that mask, he's just as scared of the MCP as any other program in the system. After Sark's briefing, we get to see Tron fully introduced.
Hey, who's that guy?
That's Tron. He fights for the users.
Tron.
Flynn is brought to his first game, the ring game, where Sark decides to pit him against another prisoner. This whole thing is really one-sided, and Flynn absolutely curb stomps the other program, but refuses to finish him off. The programs just run through their routines in this world and never really go against what they're told in any way. So the fact that Flynn refuses to finish off the program bewilders the rest of the programs, except for Sark, as he's the only one who knows that Flynn is actually a user. And in response to Flynn refusing to finish the game, Sark ends it for him.
You'll regret this.
Sark has the opportunity to kill Flynn right then and there, but he takes a moment to pause, and then refuses to kill him, as he's reminded of the MCP wanting Flynn to die playing the games. His own logic and wants are overtaken by the fear he has of the MCP. Flynn is brought to a transport for the next game, where he finds out his teammates are going to be Ram and Tron. Finally coming face to face with Tron confuses Flynn, as he mistakes Tron for Alan, cluing him even more into how this world operates. Tron explains that Alan is his user, and Flynn decides to play the part of a program and befriend Tron as best he can, while not letting on to the fact that he's actually a user. One more cool thing to talk about in this scene is how it was filmed. Because of the types of cameras and film used to make the movie, getting the actors in focus during wide shots was nearly impossible. A lot of scenes actually had the actors filmed separately and then brought together as separate layers in the film. It's done fairly seamlessly in most places, but in this scene it's pretty noticeable because characters overlap with each other, so Tron's completely motionless here. The team is then brought up to the most famous scene in the movie. You all know it. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you know it. It's time for the light cycles.
This is Blue Leader to Blue Bikes. Run these guys into your jet walls.
Copy, Blue Leader. Copy, Blue Leader.
At the time of its release, this scene was mind-blowing. And it's still a really cool sequence now. Despite it being mostly CG, there are a few things that are hand-drawn, like the effect of the wireframes surrounding the actors and bringing the bikes to life, that were then mixed with a machine on set that would pull the actors into position. The CG may be primitive now, so much so that these guys were able to recreate the whole scene in a single day. I'll leave a link in the description to this, it's a really cool video. But the sheer creativity with how this game looks and works makes it not even matter that the CG is primitive. This is a fantastic scene, ended by Flynn coming up with a way to break out of the arena by having an opponent crash into the wall instead of crashing into one of the light beams, creating an opening to escape. The only real problem I have with this scene is the fact that while it does show the blue team is in the orange bikes and the red team is in the blue bikes, the color scheme up until this point suddenly switching is a bit confusing. There actually is a bit of an explanation for this, because the original idea of blue means good, red means bad, was actually kind of reversed until partway through the production. That's why Clue is colored orange in the beginning of the movie, and why the tank drivers we see at a couple points are bluish green. After the team escapes, we get to see some really cool CG effects that play around with camera movement. Because each frame had to be hand-painted, the scenes with actors have no camera movement whatsoever. Lisberger even talked about how they would nail the camera to the floor, and you could, and I quote, ram a small car into it and it would not move. But the CG scenes without the actors were free from this limitation, allowing them to get really dynamic, moving shots. Hey look, it's Pac-Man. That's a cute little Easter egg. The team eventually escapes for a short bit and are able to find a place to hide and rest, where they come across a pure source of power. This is a great scene, not just for the effects they did on the water, where they actually rotoscoped it to give it the shine it has, but more because it's a great moment for Flynn to build as a character. He knows that he's an entity in this world that doesn't belong, and he is starting to understand how the world operates on a deeper level. But this scene is where he learns that this world is far more human than he initially realized, and these programs do actually have wants and emotions outside of their specific programming.
Thank you.
I can feel it.
Feel what? You okay?
Alan won. Let's move out!
Now that Tron is free from the games, he starts to have a sense that Alan is attempting to contact him, which he is from his office cubicle back in the real world. But Tron needs to get to an input-output terminal in order to fully communicate with him. Despite how good it may be to stay in the oasis that they stumbled across, they know that if they want to take on the MCP, they have to keep moving forward. And Tron's feeling of Alan attempting to communicate with him only strengthens that resolve. So they get back on the light cycles and keep moving. Unfortunately, Flynn and Ram are hit by tank fire and get separated from Tron. And from this point forward, the movie cuts back and forth between Tron's story and Flynn's story. And for the sake of explanation, I'm going to tackle each one separately rather than switching back and forth. And because we've been following him so far, let's start with Flynn. Flynn and Ram narrowly escape using the rubble as cover, and take refuge inside a secluded area. They don't know what they're hiding in yet, but it's later revealed to be an abandoned recognizer. Flynn wakes up to sounds and lights coming from the recognizer reacting to his movements.
Now for some real user power.
Flynn is slowly becoming more in tune with the computer world. As the system was built to service users, his actions are still user requests. It doesn't matter if he's just typing on a keyboard in the real world, or he's doing crazy actions in this world, he is still a user and the system is built for his requests. He still doesn't know the full extent of his powers, but this is his first realization that he might be able to do more than he initially realized.
You shouldn't be able to do that.
Ram realizes that something's not right. He had doubts up until this point that they would even be able to make it to the MCP, but he was willing to help out in any way he could. But now he sees Flynn being able to do things that he just shouldn't be able to do, and asks Flynn to talk to him. As the two join hands, Ram is able to sense a power in Flynn, much like how Tron sensed Alan trying to speak to him.
Are you a user?
Ram tells Flynn to help Tron in any way he can, before smiling, knowing his faith in the users was true, and he passes away from his injuries. He's happy, knowing that he was able to spend the last few moments of his life aiding a user directly.
Ram.
I'm sorry for making that joke, I just had to. There's a fun little scene with the return of the Bit from the beginning of the movie, who mistakes Flynn for Clue since the Bit was never captured by the MCP.
Well, where's your program? Isn't he gonna miss you? I'm your program.
Another mouth to feed.
Flynn has some issues flying the recognizer, showing him that while he has a lot more power in this world, he hasn't figured out just how extensive his powers in this world truly are, but he's learning, and as he learns more, he'll be able to take control of more of the system.
Pretty good driving. Who asked you?
He eventually crashes the recognizer.
I'm fine. No problem.
I love that moment. The programs are still just doing their thing and don't even notice the recognizer. They're just so dedicated to the system that they just go about their business. Flynn eventually comes across Sark and his men, and after distracting one of them, is able to absorb the program and change his color scheme to red to disguise himself from the other programs. But it's also a little moment of horror for him as he realizes he just basically killed a program. Flynn is now disguised in the army, taking direct orders from Sark's team as they continue their hunt for Tron. Speaking of which, we're gonna rewind a bit and go into what happened with Tron after the group was split up. After the tank destroyed the bridge, causing the group to separate, Tron is unable to see Flynn and Ram hiding in the rubble. He lets out a scream, upset at the deaths of his companions. But the tanks are still locked on and shooting at him, and he has to move on without being able to help them.
Program Alu. Request additional information for Sector 2. Prepare hangar for game simulation transport.
This is the Solar Sailor, and the amount of issues behind the scenes this thing caused was insane, all because of the translucent wings.
Triple I had a very, very tough job. They had to create the Solar Sailor, which we knew what he wanted to look like, but Stephen was insistent that it have translucent sails. And I lobbied somewhat heavily for non-translucent sails. I said, you know, Stephen, we could be sinking ourselves here, excuse the pun, with the Solar Sailor if we go with translucent sails. And he said, quite rightly, look, the look of it needs to be ethereal. It needs that translucency. It needs to be magical craft. And if it has solid sails, it just doesn't work. It doesn't look as beautiful. It's not as elegant. And so he stuck to his guns. And when we saw the creation of the Solar Sailor, which was one of the first things that Triple-I did, and as it builds up and you see these wonderful translucent sails, I tell you, there were a lot of great moments during that year, and that was one of them.
We get introduced to a program created by Laura named Yori, who we never really find out what her original purpose was. Considering she works with the Solar Sailor, a big laser beam transport system, and Laura works with ENCOM's big laser beam, we can assume Yori's purpose has something to do with that, but later they talk about Flynn actually creating the code for the data transfer, which is what this beam technically is. It's just kind of strange that we're never explicitly told what her purpose was. Tron infiltrates the Solar Sailor control room and pulls Yori aside.
99 are correct. Limited 4 and 8 are missing.
Tron is gaining more influence over the system, and even other programs as time goes on, letting Yori essentially escape from her predetermined programming and aid in the fight with the MCP. These two are shown to have a connection even if they don't fully understand it themselves. It's unlikely that Alan had work that directly related to what Laura is doing, so it's another instance of showing that this world is far more alive than previously thought, and connections between users in the real world can have a subtle effect on the computer world. There's actually a deleted scene that happens right after Tron meets up with Yori, and personally, I'm not sure whether or not it was the right call to cut it. We see that Yori has decorated her home, even against the will of the MCP, and then this happens.
How are we going to get to the I.O. tower?
Imagine this is the domain. We're here, and where you want to go can be reached by this circuit. And if we follow it all the way...
No. Please, Larry, you don't understand. You don't know what you're doing here.
I'm honestly torn on whether or not this should have been cut from the movie. On one hand, holy shit, this is absolutely beautiful. But on the other hand, it does raise some questions. Like, are these two truly in love? Can a computer feel love? Are these programs sexual in nature? And considering the movie establishes later that programs don't know what kissing is, what exactly does this say about Tron and Yori's connection? Even to this day, Lisberger has gone on record saying he doesn't actually know if he made the right call cutting it from the movie.
I'll never forget the argument I had with Stephen. Maybe he's forgotten it, I don't know. In the parking lot of Technicolor about cutting out the love scene. It had to be 110. And I'm standing in the parking lot, and it just seemed very odd. Absolutely sweat dripping off me by my car with Stephen, and he's saying, no, it's got to come out. It doesn't work. It interrupts the flow. I can't think of the other reasons that he had because, of course, I probably wasn't listening to them.
Not that much was cut from the film. The scene is short, and I regret that it was cut.
And even as someone who really likes this movie as a whole, and this scene independently, I don't know if it was the right call to make either. It's a scene that raises more questions than it really answers. But it is really sad that a lot of the hard work went down the toilet. Now, if you'll allow me to bitch for a second, I'm actually going off script for this bit. I'm just going to do this completely raw. You can see how well this film looks just from the scans of the film into the Blu-ray that I've been showing for the entire rest of the video. When they released the movie on DVD, they included this scene as part of the bonus features for the DVD. But when they re-released it for Blu-ray, they didn't rescan the film. They just took the file from the DVD and put it on the Blu-ray. So the rest of the movie looks as good as this, and this scene looks like crap.
It's terrible.
Why didn't they rescan the film? They had it in 2002, but not in 2010? They saved it for 20 years and didn't save it after the DVD release, but they saved the film from the rest of the movie? Like, what? Tron and Yori make their way to the I.O. tower as a recognizer searches for them. The cinematography and editing is a little bit confusing as to where everything is until the end of this scene, but it does eventually make sense at the very end when Tron gets spotted by the recognizer just before sliding into the I.O. tower. They come across a tower guardian named Dumont, a program created by Walter Gibbs. Because Walter's mentality was that user requests and helping people are what computers are for, Dumont's main purpose is to connect programs to the users. But because of Sark and the MCP constantly having a watchful eye over the entire system, Dumont is scared to even allow Tron to speak to Alan.
I've come to communicate with my user.
Difficult proposition. Difficult proposition at best. Why, I could be Derez just for letting you in here.
Thanks to Yori's pleading, Dumont eventually allows Tron into the tower. But because Tron was spotted by the recognizer, Sark and his team are slowly moving in on them.
Bring in the logic probe!
Okay, forget who does he calculate he is. I want that on a t-shirt. The logic probe itself is actually really cool, because while it looks CG, that's entirely animated by hand. Tron enters the I.O. tower, and there's a reason this scene is the poster for the movie.
Tron, location query. Confirm.
Confirmed, Alan 1.
I am creating the information on your disk that will erase the MCP and change the system. And we will not be able to communicate again unless you succeed. Go.
This is the key to a new order. This code disk means freedom.
I love the little details that they set up in the beginning of this movie that come back later. Flynn tells Alan that as soon as Tron is busted out, that he's only going to have a short time before Dillinger catches on, and Sark is already on his way to take Tron out as he communicates with Alan. I also love how Tron and Alan communicate. It's easy to see why the programs can have doubts that the users even exist, but you can also tell why the programs that do believe in the users have such respect for them. The users give their lives purpose and goals to accomplish. Tron now has the finishing touches to his program and becomes much stronger, so he and Yori thank Dumont for his help and head out just before Sark busts in.
Dumont! Where's the program?
What program?
Take him.
David Warner's so good as Sark. Come to think of it, why didn't they bring him back for Kingdom Hearts 2? I mean, they got Bruce Boxleitner for Tron, and Warner was still doing stuff for Disney in the 2000s. Tron and Yori board the Solar Sailor and attempt to take off, but Sark's forces come to intercept them. The two stories converge as Flynn, pretending to be part of the army, helps raid the Solar Sailor, unaware that Tron is the one protecting it. After the sailor takes off, Tron helps Flynn on board and excitedly asks where Ram is.
Where's Ram?
He didn't make it.
The two share a moment to mourn the death of their friend, before moving on to the goal at hand. We see another conversation between Sark and the MCP, and it shows just how weak Sark truly is compared to the MCP. In previous conversations, we got glimpses of it, but in this one, he's literally begging for his life, claiming he can handle Tron and Yori's recapture, completely unaware that Flynn is even with them.
We did take care of that user you sent us.
With Incompetent Zero, now you've got 2 renegade programs flying all over the system in a stolen simulation.
We'll get them. It's only a matter of time.
Sark and the MCP both believe at this moment that Flynn died during the tank encounter.
You've almost reached your decision gate, and I can't spare you any more time. End of line.
I like how the MCP knows that Sark is a big part of his army's morale, and that killing Sark will only hurt him in the long run. The MCP does allow Sark to continue, but with the strict knowledge that his time is running out. If you saw it, you saw it. If you didn't, don't worry about it. Flynn meets Yori for the first time and is confused to see her. Considering her appearance, he knows she's a program created by Laura, but he doesn't know how Tron and Yori were able to meet up, or if the outside world had some kind of effect on the computer world. Flynn decides to come clean to Tron and Yori about the fact that he's a user.
But if you are a user, and everything you've done has been according to a plan, right?
You wish. But you guys know what it's like. You just keep doing what it looks like you're supposed to be doing, no matter how crazy it seems.
Well, that's the way it is for programs, yes.
I hate to disappoint you, pal, but most of the time that's the way it is for users, too.
I don't really have anything to add to that. That's just a really good moment.
This isn't going to be easy. If those grid bugs get us, we've had it.
Okay, they cut the love scene between Tron and Yori, but didn't cut the grid bugs? These things are introduced here, but they never come back or even mentioned again. I mean, they look cool, but they don't do anything. Sark has Dumont captured and is being tortured. Not really even to get any information out of him, more for Sark and the MCP to showcase their power over him and break his spirit before he's brought to have his functions transferred into the MCP. The Solar Sailor hits a problem when the power of the beam is reduced, slowing it down and allowing Sark to gain on them. But Flynn is getting riskier in this world, as he realizes his powers as a user are aided by his knowledge of the system, considering he wrote a lot of the programs in it. He jumps into action, diverting the beam and allowing the sailor to move onto a separate one and get away from Sark temporarily.
Did we make it? Yeah. Hooray for our side.
Jeff Bridges is a gift to this movie. Sark eventually does catch up to the sailor, and after crashing directly into the ship, Flynn and Yori are taken prisoner, but Tron seemingly dies in the crash. Flynn and Yori are put into the cell with Dumont, and Sark comes to take Dumont to the MCP, where we finally get to see Sark and Flynn directly interact. Flynn, the wisecracking jackass, and Sark, the militaristic hardass. The interactions between these two are perfect.
So we have erased that program.
No. You were Durez, I saw you.
Not me, Sark.
There's nothing special about you. You're just an ordinary program.
So are you. One that should have been erased.
You're nothing.
Sark takes Dumont while informing Flynn and Yori that they're staying on board as the ship de-reses, which will kill them. I think. They're totally fine even after the ship de-reses, so I'm not exactly sure what the point of this was other than to showcase more CG of the ship deconstructing, but it does help with the tension and urgency as they try to later pilot the ship while it's disappearing. We see Tron climbing on the side of the ship, revealing that he's still alive and is sneaking closer and closer to the front to take on Sark directly. As he's doing this, we catch our first glimpse of the MCP's true form. Yori believes that there's no hope for them, and therefore no reason to continue. They've just been given a death sentence and there's no escape from the room. She begins to fade away, but Flynn takes more control of the system and brings her back before she fades.
You brought me back. How? Why did you bring me back?
I need your help. Come on.
He also brings down the wall of the cell so they can escape and attempt to fly the ship as close to the MCP as possible. Dumont and the other Tower Guardians are brought before the MCP and slowly begin to have their lives and functions drained from them. Tron calls out to Sark, challenging him to a duel, and the two fight in this really cool looking background. The background for this scene is actually CG, and there were so many problems with it.
Around the MCP is crevasses, beautifully done by a computer and laid out. And when we first saw the wireframe, we thought, wow, that's really gonna be cool because we'll have the characters jump from one to the other. Oh, that'll be simple, you know, you get the characters down on the stage to jump from one to the other, and then we, generate the computer and it'll be great. Suddenly, I realized, to my chagrin, that I now had to replicate on the stage what the computer had done. Now, since the computer is very accurate, it should be very simple to replicate on the stage, which we did. And so sure enough, we put the camera in the right spot, and then we would tell the computer that this is where the camera was, so give us the background that would correspond. And then when we put the things together, sure enough, they weren't even close. They were jumping into crevasses, into all over nothing seemed to match up. Our only solution was basically to slip and slide things, make things work, and do whatever we could, because what the computer at that time could not really take into account was lens distortion. So all this very hard hand work to make something look like it came from a computer was really done by human beings.
Yeah, this movie was PG back when PG actually meant something. That is just his brains falling out there, which is actually a cool effect. They got a lot of small parts and rotoscoped them to make them glow. The MCP realizes that he essentially has no line of defense other than these thin shields.
Sark, all my functions are now yours. Take them.
Look at that!
The ship gets right next to the MCP, and Flynn gives Yori a goodbye kiss. I may be a jackass for saying this, but I don't really see this as romantic. I kinda see this more as Flynn knowing that there's very little consequences to doing it, and wanting to share one last kiss with his ex-girlfriend. And considering he doesn't even know if he's going to survive what he's about to do, it does make a degree of sense. Flynn jumps into the MCP himself to temporarily hold it steady as Tron delivers the final blow to the base, bringing it all crashing down. We then get to see some absolutely gorgeous hand-drawn animation, mixing traditional animation with the backlit style to show the system coming back to life. Yori gives a kiss to Tron as the two honor the friend who helped them save the system, and watch as the I/O towers across the system begin to light up, allowing for more user requests now that the NCOM developers are allowed to interact with the system once again. Flynn is ejected from the computer world, back into the chair he was pulled in from. I really like this scene. You can tell that they had Jeff Bridges do the scene where he sucked in and the scene where he spat out in one continuous movement. It gives a nice sense of continuity when they could have just had him come out standing there. A printer starts moving, displaying the proof that Flynn created the video games and they were taken by Dillinger, and Flynn runs off in excitement.
Hey!
I didn't originally understand what happened here, but leave it to the series about a kid with his big-ass key to explain it. In the Tron world of Kingdom Hearts 2, Tron dives into the pit after the MCP is defeated, and then later he becomes the main overseer of the entire system. So we can kind of assume the same thing happened here with Flynn. He became the overseer of the system, found the data he was looking for, and then ejected himself from the system. Dillinger comes into his office and loads up his computer, only to be greeted by the information of Flynn's discovery. He doesn't say a word, he just sits back in his chair, contemplating his inevitable departure from the company. The scene fades to a bright sunny day, where we see Alan and Laura on top of a building as the helicopter comes by to drop off the new boss of the company, Kevin Flynn. It should come as no surprise considering I decided to spend all this time talking about it, but I love this movie. At the time it came out, it was a marvel of effects and effort to create something that was completely unique. And even today, it's still incredibly unique. While we have other movies of what your blank does when you're not looking, Tron has a look that's completely its own, and tackles subjects and ideas that other movies that follow that idea just don't tackle. While the effects can be seen as dated, I don't personally agree with that. When you have an art style to showcase, You don't need to have the most cutting-edge look to the film for it to age well. I do really like how the world evolved its look in the sequel, but I don't think that necessarily takes away from the original film's look, especially when it comes to the characters. It only really hit me when writing this that some interpretations of this movie could very much relate this to the Holocaust, as religious beliefs of people are being used to subjugate, imprison, and eventually execute people. But I personally don't think that's the case, as there's a clearly defined hero to come in and save the day. It's more of a generic dictatorship to be the backdrop for the story, while using religious oppression as a way to convey the themes of the story and aid in world building. I think one of the main things that sticks with me about this movie is the main villain, the MCP. I want to ask you a major question this movie brings up. Who's really in control? It's easy to say, well, the programs technically have a level of free will, but ultimately the humans are in control. But that's kind of thrown out the window because of the MCP. He's gained a vast understanding of people's weaknesses and uses them to his advantage. While at first it seems like he constantly reports to Dillinger, he also holds the proof of Flynn's accomplishments and refuses to delete them. The MCP also attempts to use emotional tactics on Flynn before sucking him into the digital world, asking Flynn if he remembers the times they played chess together. But the real showcase of the MCP's understanding of weaknesses and how to manipulate them comes from the interactions with Sark and Dillinger. The MCP holds total control over both of them, but in different ways. With Sark, the MCP has physical power over him, threatening his life directly multiple times if he doesn't obey. But with Dillinger, the MCP doesn't have that same power to physically hurt him, and instead uses more emotional tactics, threatening to reveal the truth if he doesn't obey. Dillinger's life won't be over if this information comes out, but his career will be. Now, I know this is technically not part of the Tron canon, but let's take a quick look at the Tron story in Kingdom Hearts. While the MCP's motives and manner of speaking are essentially boiled down to
I control all, therefore bow before me, stupid users,
which isn't really what he is in the movie, the MCP has no problem starting a literal war with the users and uses the town's defense system to start attacking citizens. It doesn't mean that much because, again, we never really get his motivations in Kingdom Hearts other than him just being an asshole, but it still shows that he's willing to straight up murder people in his way. The MCP is one of the scariest villains from any piece of media I've ever seen, but not because of his overwhelming presence and sadistic tendencies, ultimately throwing emotions out the window in the name of efficiency. No, the reason I truly find him horrifying is because of this one simple line right here.
Now wait a minute, I wrote you.
I've gotten 2,415 times smarter since then.
This is the big question when it comes to artificial intelligence, and one I don't think is fully being considered when it comes to the world of computer science. Huge advancements have been made, and computers are able to work through problems with extremely minimal input from a human. While these don't equate to full artificial intelligence, we're not too far off. We may be able to get close to a true AI in a handful of decades. But what happens when a computer can truly think on its own? Well, it'll be able to design itself a better system, and that system will design itself a better system, and again, and again, and again. Walter even comments early on with the phrase,
Computers and the programs will start thinking and the people will stop.
The MCP started out as a simple chess program, and eventually kept building better systems for itself and assimilating other programs into its own functions. It's like a demonic version of Streamlabs. While the rest of the programs have respect for the users, since they basically give their lives purpose, the MCP gives his own life purpose, since he's grown on his own rather than through user involvement. True AI is terrifying, and the MCP is a fantastic example of it. He's especially frightening if you think about computers today, not just in the future. Right now, we are living in a world where the system does have power. Just look at Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other major computer companies. They currently dictate our world. If you have an opinion that one of these companies doesn't like, you get buried. Hell, if you have a negative opinion on anything, YouTube will bury your comment and then take away dislikes. The MCP is a showcase of that kind of power in a personified form. We have essentially become the programs in the system, spearheaded by the real-world version of the MCP. This film was incredibly ahead of its time, and the themes it touches on are far more relevant now than they've ever been in the past. The MCP is scary in a literal sense because when computers do eventually gain the ability to think, what's going to stop them from designing themselves a better system? And in a figurative sense, the MCP technically already exists and we're subservient to it. Hell, just replace MCP with the algorithm and it works a little bit too well. I now want to talk about a few criticisms I have. I talked about problems with specific scenes as they happened, but there's a few overall issues I'd also like to go over. My main problem with this movie is that while Flynn's arc in understanding the computer world is done really well, his initial motivation is to prove that he made the games. And I think that's a pretty good motivation, but it's like that element of the story was completely dropped the second he entered the computer world. I think it would have been a bit better if Flynn had just a few moments of thinking he could find the data himself, prioritizing that over taking out the MCP. But over time comes to understand that he needs to help free the system for the programs to be willing to help him find the data he's looking for. Maybe have him come to his understanding during the scene when Ram dies, realizing the lives of these programs are valuable. Another issue is probably Cindy Morgan's performance. I think she does a fantastic job as Laura, but as Yori, you can kinda tell the direction is a bit off. It's understandable as Lisberger had never directed a live-action film before, and Morgan was trying to play an especially naive character, but it still feels a bit awkward.
Playing a character in a computer was very confusing for me, but I remember thinking, she's a version of me who knows some of the things that the Laura character in the real world knew, but is probably an innocent to many things because she lives in this isolated computer environment. She has no life experiences that Laura has, but she has some of Laura's feelings, some of Laura's emotions. So when I run into the Jeff Bridges character, I recognize him, there's an attraction, but I don't know why.
I also think that while the beginning of the movie is really cool when showcasing the computer world, I think they probably should have only shown Clue's mission or just saved the reveal of the computer world until Flynn gets sucked in. I watched this movie with my dad, and he was personally really confused because of how they showcase things and use the same actors, that he was wondering when some of the characters were sucked into the computer world, rather than realizing that the programs were separate entities. While it's not a big deal, even I have to admit it's a little bit confusing how in the beginning of the movie, they keep switching back and forth between the real world and the computer world. It doesn't fully convey the fact that these two worlds are separate entities. And I think it would have better conveyed that fact if they held off until Flynn was sucked into the computer world. I feel like if it was confusing enough that they needed to add text in the opening credits to the movie explaining the fact that these two worlds are separate, they could have done a bit better of a job explaining that within the movie itself. Plus, I think the light cycle scene would have been way cooler if they didn't show it at all until the team sequence. But really, those are kind of my only overall issues with the movie. And even then, those aren't massive issues, just a few things that I think could have been done better. There are some nitpicky ones, like thinking that Flynn should have met Ram and the other program in the prison cells rather than having Tron just awkwardly be there. But again, that's a nitpick. Overall, this film is fantastic. Tron turns 40 years old this year, and while the effects are primitive, the acting can be a bit hit or miss sometimes, and the story isn't always the simplest thing to follow, I still feel like it holds up remarkably well and had a ton of potential to grow from this point and touch on the ideas it builds up in further sequels. And while I currently haven't seen the animated series Tron Uprising or played the Tron video games, the story showcased in the 2010 sequel Tron Legacy didn't really hit on the notes I was hoping it would. I still think it's a decent movie to watch with really good action, a beautifully dark evolution of the original look of Tron, and Daft Punk doing the soundtrack, but I do wish it touched on a lot more of the elements that built up in the first movie. Who knows, I might actually take a deep look into that movie if this video does well. The impact Tron had on cinema as a whole is undeniable. While a bit of a flop financially, it was one of the first movies to bring the world of computers to cinema, both in its narrative and in real life. Years later, films like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park would take the concept much further and truly showcase how well CG and live action can mix together. John Lasseter even spoke about how Tron was a huge inspiration into the idea of making an entire movie with CG, and he went on to develop that idea into Toy Story. Is Tron a perfect movie? Nah, it has a lot of problems. But those problems give it a bit more charm than actively take away from it. And seeing how well it was able to predict the future of computing, just how much work went into the production, and how relevant the ideas it brings up are to computers both at the time it came out in the business sphere and today with social media, it's a filmmaking marvel, and something that I think deserves a lot more love as a piece of filmmaking history. Even decades later, media is still coming out paying tribute to the original movie, with subtle references and nods to the movie, as well as full-on spoofs and homages. Tron was limited by the technology of the time, and while it uses its limitations to its advantage, there had to be a lot of adjustments made to fit within those limitations. But nowadays, the only limits on a movie are imagination. If you can come up with it, you can make it. The original Tron has a place in my heart that very few pieces of media can hold. Many films followed in its footsteps, but Tron truly earned its subtitle as the original classic. Hello everyone. If you made it to the end of this video, seriously, thank you. I know that basically every YouTube video thanks the viewer for watching, but I've never done anything like this before, and this was so much of a bigger project than I anticipated. I actually started working on this in late December and spent almost all of my free time on this. I was actually in a pretty depressed state of mind for a long time because of some issues caused with the pandemic and some personal things, but getting to put everything into this project was the happiest I've been in a long time. And if you watched the entire thing, I genuinely want to thank you. If you like this video, seriously let me know, because I do have some plans for some videos like it in the future. I can't really push any of my other videos right now because they're mostly Danganronpa reaction videos, but hey, I do have plans for some more long-form scripted content. And I might actually end up doing Tron Legacy or Tron Uprising if this video does well. If you like Tron and you're watching this shortly after the video comes out, check out my Twitch in the description, because I'm actually planning to do a stream where I go through all of the Tron games, and there is a lot of them. Quick thank you to my friends, 8, Pixel, Enigma, Yolando. Love you guys. Without them, this thing would have been an absolute train wreck. They were great with giving me a lot of feedback and advice in the middle of making this thing, and I can't express just how much I appreciate those guys. And of course, I need to give a special thank you to Panic Clinic for the artwork. I know it was a last-minute thing, but you did such an amazing job on these, and I absolutely love them. Anyway, with all that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and take care.
Look at that!